Britain's upcoming general election looks set to be a defining moment for the country's relation with the rest of the EU. The large degree of uncertainty over the outcome means that no one can tell if the result will lead to an in-out referendum on Britain's EU membership. How will the next government deal with the so-called European question? What are the possible scenarios? To be or not to be in the EU? Welcome to Talking Europe. I'm Christoph Robies. I'm at the European Parliament here in Brussels. Now joining me, Charles Tannock. Hello. You're a member of the European Parliament from the Conservative Party. Your constituency is London. Also with us, Mary Honeyball. You also represent London, but you belong to the Labour Party. And last but not least, Jonathan Arnott. You're from UKIP, the UK Independence Party. And I believe your constituency is in the northeast of England. Now, as I said, the results won't be known until the late hours of the 7th of May. Polls show that currently it's too close to call. Nobody knows who might be the next Prime Minister of Britain, and no party seems likely to secure a majority. Mrs. Honeyball, if your champion, Ed Miliband, becomes the next Prime Minister of Britain, what do you do with the European question?
Well, you've outlined the European question, and obviously it is of huge interest here. And who wins the election in the UK will matter enormously to Europe. The Labour Party policy has been clear for many years. We don't think it's appropriate or necessary to have a referendum at the moment, and that really informs a lot of the rest of the policy. We believe that Britain's place is in the EU because Britain derives huge benefits from the EU. About 3 million jobs are dependent on being in Europe, and almost half of our exports and foreign investment are dependent on the EU.
And given the uneasy relationship between Britain and Europe, why don't you believe that a referendum would put the question to rest for at least a generation?
Well, it may not. I mean, that's an assumption you're making. It may well not do that. And also, I don't think you can just have referendums for the sake of it. We've always had referendums in the UK on very specific issues when there's been constitutional change. But what the Labour Party has said, if there is that constitutional change, if more powers come from Brussels to Westminster or from Westminster to Brussels, if there's a change in the relationship, we would be prepared to have a referendum then. It's quite a clear policy that we have.
Charles Tannock, the British Prime Minister David Cameron has repeatedly said that if he wins a second term, he will hold a referendum before 2017. Why this move, and isn't it risky? Because the markets are very nervous. They don't like uncertainty. If Mr. Cameron wins the election, you won't know for at least 2 years whether Britain does stay in the EU.
Well, David Cameron has rightly, in my view, decided in his policy that there will be a referendum if he is elected to single-party government. Obviously, the Liberals may have a different view, or any other coalition partner, but clearly the Conservatives think it's time for renewed consent of our membership. Many powers have been ceded to Brussels since 1975, when we had the last referendum. Anybody who's younger than me, and I'm 57, would never have had an opportunity to vote on the question of whether we wish to be part of this club. I've always said publicly I'm in favour of Britain's continued membership of the European Union. I look forward to the debate. I believe that I can win the debates against parties like UKIP. And I'd also like to say that in the first past the post system, of course, UKIP may well deny this referendum, because every UKIP vote which denies a Conservative MP their place in the House of Commons will mean less likelihood of a referendum.
Well, let's bring in Mr. Arnott. You represent UKIP. Now, your message during this campaign is very clear. You're anti-immigration, anti-Europe. You want to leave now.
Yeah, I mean, we're anti-uncontrolled immigration. Of course, we're pro an Australian-style points-based system in which we bring into the people into the UK who have the skills that we need in the UK. But there's so much nonsense talks. We've had the supreme arrogance there from the Conservatives, assuming that anybody who is a UKIP voter would otherwise be going to his party, which quite clearly would not be the case. We hear the scaremongering of Labour saying that 3 million jobs would be at risk if we weren't in the EU. Of course not. We'd continue to trade with Europe. We'd continue to be good neighbours with Europe. No, not at a price.
There'd be tariffs imposed, there'd be non-tariff barriers, we would lose jobs. The car industry would not be able to export export as easily as they can to the single market. That's a valued issue for all foreign investors to have access to the single market. You would not have the immediate and automatic right to the single market.
And as you perfectly know, of course,
and you may
the
well
treaty establishing the European Economic Area is separate from the various treaties from the Treaty of Rome. We have the opportunity of being in the EEA as a holding position for negotiations, so no, there is no question of tariffs. And besides that, of course, the key point here is, look, think about it. We are in trade deficit with the European Union. Of course, Europe needs our trade, and of course we want to work together with Europe. Of course we want to be good trading partners with Europe, and even, of course, going back to the time of Kinnock as EU Commissioner, he made it quite clear there would not be that kind of trade war that you're trying to scaremonger the British public.
Now, we discuss Europe because we're in Brussels, but is Europe really the reason why voters will vote for Mr. Farage?
It's part of it. I mean, of course, there's Europe, there's immigration. As we've said, controlling our borders is very important. Issues like raising the tax threshold so no one on a standard working week on minimum wage pays a penny piece in income tax. That's something we've been talking about for years, and they've come up with their sort of fake reflection of it in the last couple of days.
We're taking millions of people out of taxation.
Do respond.
No, I mean, I personally believe that David Cameron has a very sensible agenda. He actually has said publicly he wants Britain to stay in the European Union, but on a reform basis. He particularly wants to stop the pull factors of access to our social security system, particularly in work benefits and the non-contributory benefits, which the system that we've enjoyed in Britain. And that's one of the reasons that now we've seen such a large movement of people from the new EU member states who are much poorer. He wants to stop that and restrict access to benefits, but he doesn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because actually, on balance, the movement of EU migrants has been positive for our economy. In London, the EU migrants have been net payers into the system.
Cameron's had 5 years and he hasn't got rid of one single stroke of a pen from one piece of EU legislation, and yet he's selling this idea that he can do this massive negotiation in the next 2 years. We've had 40 years of attempted reform of the European Union. It simply is not
Well, let's
working.
put a question to Mary Hannibal. Is Mr. Cameron credible when he says that he will be able to renegotiate the terms of Britain's EU membership and then put it to the British voters in an in-out referendum?
Well, the Labour Party also, of course, has said we want to reform the EU. So I think there's a bit of consensus here. And in a very similar way in some of our policies, Labour has said that we will not allow immigrants from the EU to claim benefits for the first 2 years. We're very, very clear on that. And of course, Charles is right when he says also that EU immigrants have had benefits, certainly in London, and we both represent London. So although we think the EU needs reforming, and I think those of us who are here know that there are things which could need change in the institution, we want to do it within the context of Europe and with the context of Britain being in the EU.
Now, Ed Miliband saying that he wants Britain to stay in Europe may be regarded as a bold move, at least from Brussels or from Paris, given the mood in Britain. How do voters respond to his positions on Europe?
Well, I think the mood is a bit exaggerated. At no time when opinion polls have been taken about Britain leaving the EU has there been a clear majority to leave. It's always been close, but generally it's been to stay in. So I always think this is a bit of scaremongering. I mean, I'm not sure when it came to a referendum, I'm not at all sure that the British people would want to leave. I'm sure they would want to stay in the EU.
Well, I've been all around London campaigning, obviously from a different perspective from Mary, supporting our Conservative candidates, and nowhere at the doorstep do I hear this resounding message, it's all about our membership of the European Union. You get one or two hardline UKIP supporters, it's all about the EU, but for the majority of the British people, and particularly Londoners, they are going to fight this battle and vote accordingly in the election on the basis of how they perceive Mr. Miliband as Prime Minister versus Mr. Cameron on the world stage, how they see the economy, and I believe the Conservatives have managed the economy well, how they see things like defence and security in the hands of a Labour government versus a Conservative government. For most of the electorate, our membership of the European Union is not the #1 deciding factor on the way they're going to vote on the 7th of May.
Of course, if you look at those issues, you mentioned the economy, defence, security, all of them actually tie back into the European Union in a lot of ways. But when we talk about renegotiation, this idea that we're going to reform the European Union, of course we need 28 countries to all agree. And David Cameron has come up with his wonderful rhetoric about how he wants to reform the European Union. But he talks about issues like the free movement of workers, and Juncker says that can't be done. You look at Merkel, she says that can't be done. You look look at Francois Hollande, he'll say that that can't be done. Nobody is actually saying that this is even on the table. It's not even up for discussion.
They also said that the EU budget couldn't be reformed, that couldn't be done, but David Cameron delivered on that and got actually the British rebate safeguarded and less of a contribution.
Well, that does not require treaty change.
And the fact of the matter is that Britain is a very big net contributor to the EU budget. So I would hardly think that France or Germany would want that money to be taken out of the pot for the rest of Europe.
So
there's very strong reasons to want to keep us in the club.
I say on this that the Labour Party has never talked about treaty change, and we don't necessarily need treaty change to reform the EU. There's a lot that can be done without that, just by negotiation, and that's actually what we've laid out in our manifesto. And yes, we know there are things that need reforming. No one's ever claimed that
what does the Labour Party want to reform in the current relationship with?
Well, certainly, as I said, we will do something about benefits for migrants coming from the EU. We will not allow people to claim benefits for 2 years, and that's obviously a key thing. I think we need to look at the way this place works, and we need better regulation and better lawmaking. So I think there's a lot that can be done there. And the other thing that I would like to see, which isn't necessarily a reform, but it could work the other way round, I would like to see some of the emphasis that we put here on women's rights and equality going back to the UK, so that we can actually learn from what happens in the EU.
Now, as you said, François Hollande and Angela Merkel certainly want to keep Britain in Europe because it's important for the prestige of the European Union. But when you look at Britain, I mean, Britain is not in Schengen. Britain has an opt-out on many policies.
Not in the Eurozone.
It's not in the Eurozone.
And we'll stay out of it forever.
So what else do you want, Mr. Tannock?
No, I mean, as I said, I'm actually in favour of staying in the European Union, but I think a reformed European Union. I think there are some irritants, particularly the issue of access to social security.
And you believe that Jean-Claude Juncker is able to
There are other things. I would like to see the structural funds repatriated. It's ridiculous that rich countries like Germany and Britain are getting structural funds. They should be only for the much poorer members of the European Union. I would like to see things like some of the employment legislation repatriated to the national government. So there's my own favourite list, and I'm sure David Cameron and the thinkers and the advisors behind him are thinking what is feasible, what can be done. We believe there may well be a need for a minor treaty change to accommodate some of our issues, but clearly we don't want a wholesale reform of the treaties, because that would be very difficult, but I think they could be tweaked to accommodate our needs.
Now, because of the first past the post system, Nigel Farage is unlikely to become the next Prime Minister, but he could, of course, make a difference if he gets a large amount of votes. What will you seek to do to achieve after the elections?
Well, I think if you see in the UK, the Liberal Democrats, of course, went into a coalition with the Conservative Party. In some ways, they really sold their soul to do so. Now, that's one thing that
you're not willing to enter a coalition.
We are not
I think
willing
we have to make major compromises too, the Conservatives, believe you me, particularly over Europe and things like that.
I will concede that you sold your soul too.
I wouldn't say we sold our soul. We made compromises in the coalition agreement.
But you know, I think the honourable way is to make sure that you vote in accordance with your conscience, in accordance with the way that your constituents would want you to vote. You don't make wholesale changes to your policy on the hoof. You stand up for what you should be voting for. Now, of course, there are elements in which, in certain situations, where a confidence and supply agreement, where you don't bring a government down on motions of confidence, where you allow orderly government to continue, that is something that we would look at. And an EU referendum is certainly one of the things that we would be looking to make sure happens, and happens quickly, for exactly the reason, actually, that you mentioned earlier. Because, as you say, there is a lack of confidence within markets when something like this drags on for year after year. We want this to be dealt with ASAP.
Too quickly. 2016, which in my view will not give enough time to negotiate the kind of changes and repatriation
and potentially
powers.
To convince you.
You've had 5 years already, remember?
Well, we haven't been in single-party government. We've been in government with the Liberals, and they would not have been
in single-party government after the election either, are you?
But the point about the UKIP confidence supply deal, if they were to back a Conservative government, they said they want to have the referendum next year. I believe that's too accelerated a process to do the deals we need with Germany, France, and other members of the European Union, and I think think 2017 is a much more realistic date. Besides which, we've also got to look at the Eurozone and sorting out the Brexit issue, stabilising the Eurozone. The dust has to settle economically on the rest of the continent. So Cameron's got the right date. UK want it too quickly, in my view.
Well, it's a point of principle.
I think all of that just goes to show why a referendum would be so dangerous for the UK, because it would create instability. It would create instability before. If whatever happens afterwards, there would not be stability. And we know that the business community, the vast majority of the business community in the UK, do not want a referendum on the European Union membership.
And do not want to leave Europe, as far as
I do agree on one thing, and this is a serious issue. I hope there's a clear majority, one way or another, and I hope that UKIP and other parties will abide by the decision of the people. I've said publicly, if the British people vote to leave, I will respect that and work with that. And similarly, I hope that UKIP will accept the result if they vote to stay in. But I suspect many UKIP members the next day will carry on campaigning for another referendum, asking to leave.
That's precisely what we see in Scotland,
precisely
with
what
the Scottish referendum.
It may not settle it, and it's precisely what UKIP have always accused the European Union of doing, of having another referendum until they get the right result which they want.
Well, we want to have a free and fair referendum. Personally, all I can say, all I can speak for is myself. And personally, if a vote goes that way and it's a fair vote, then of course you accept the result of that vote. And there may come a time in the future when you look at those things again, of course. But I mean, this idea that the British people, and Tony Blair has said this very recently, that the British people can't be trusted to have a referendum in Europe, I think is absolute nonsense.
Oh.
I think it's playing for the lowest common denominator in British politics, because the idea that people can't be trusted, you've only got to look actually at the Scottish referendum, where you saw a very, very high turnout. You saw people engaged in politics. Why? Because people care about political issues in the UK. I'm passionate about that. I'm passionate about not just having a referendum on Europe, but actually key moral issues as well as decided on free votes in Parliament at the moment. Giving people more power is what engages them with politics at the moment. So many people just see politics as irrelevant to them. We've got to do something about it.
We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid, as we're running out of time. But thank you very much, Mary Honeyball, Charles Tannock and Jonathan Arnott, for taking part in this edition of Talking Europe Now.